The fluorescent lights hum at 60 Hz, a frequency that lives in Ashley Cooper's teeth. She's learned to stop noticing it, learned to stop noticing most things over 3 years of keeping her head down, her past buried, and her hand steady enough to pass for normal. The ICU at Sacred Heart smells like antiseptic and industrial coffee, the same smell at every hospital in the city, which is precisely why she chose this one. Anonymous. Replaceable. Just another nurse in scrubs that fit nobody and a name tag that meant nothing to anyone who might recognize what she used to be. She arrives at 6:22 a.m., 17 minutes before shift change, the same time every morning. Her badge swipes green. The doors hiss open. The ICU corridor stretches out in that particular quiet that only exists before the hospital wakes up, before the machines start their chorus, before the families arrive carrying their desperation-like luggage, before the day becomes what it's going to become. Ashley moves through it like she's made of the same fluorescent light, bleached of detail, remarkable only in her unremarkableness. Her locker is the same as any other locker. Scrubs folded in a specific order. A single photograph, her son at his high school graduation, smiling at the camera with eyes that look exactly like hers. No personal touches. No family photos crowding the metal door. No reminder notes taped to mirrors. Just the essentials of a life that fits into 18 inches of vertical space. And underneath everything, on the floor of the locker, beneath the spare shoes and the backup ID badge, sits a pair of combat boots. Not new. Not polished for display. These boots are weathered the way only boots worn in 130-degree heat for 14 months can be weathered, the leather cracked like a map of every place they've carried her. She touches them once before closing the door, a ritual she doesn't examine too closely. A talisman. A name tag for someone she no longer introduces herself as. The boots are the only part of that life she kept. Everything else, the dress blues hanging in a climate-controlled storage unit across Denver, the decorations, the photographs, the letters from command, all of it locked away behind a key she carries on her keychain, disguised as a house key, because her son must never know. The shift begins like every shift begins. Vital signs. For checks. Medication administration. Her hands move through the routines with the precision of someone who has done these things thousands of times. 5 patients in her assignment, a 67-year-old male post-surgical, a 41-year-old female with sepsis, a 73-year-old male recovering from a stroke, a 49-year-old female on a ventilator, a 34-year-old male with pneumonia. She knows the reports by heart before she reads them. She knows which monitors beep anxiously and which ones lie. She knows which patients will make it and which ones won't, though she keeps that knowledge locked away where it can't hurt anyone. By 8:15 a.m., the hospital is running at full velocity. The ER is packed. Surgeries are underway. Families cluster in waiting rooms drinking terrible coffee and reading month-old magazines. The normal chaos of a Level 1 trauma center in a city the size of Denver, 350 beds, 40,000 admissions per year, and Ashley moves through it invisibly, the way she's learned to move through the world since she left the military. She's updating a medication chart at 8:42 a.m. when the radio crackles to life. Incoming. Trauma alert. Priority 1. ETA for minutes. Critical burn victim from structure fire, veterans shelter on Downing Street. 3rd-degree burns, extensive smoke inhalation, unconscious on arrival. Paramedics are running 2 large bore lines, O2 at 15 liters, pain management in progress. Secondary victim with minor burns already transported to Mercy General. The room doesn't shift. The monitors don't change their rhythm. But something changes anyway, the way air pressure changes before a storm. Ashley's hands that have held other people's lives together in places where the electricity failed and the morphine ran dry, pause on the chart. She doesn't move. Not yet. Dr. Sterling arrives in the ICU at 8:49 a.m., trailing 2 hospital board members whose names Ashley has never learned and never will. His shoes click against the linoleum. Italian leather. $1,200, probably more. She's learned to read the cost of things, learned to recognize the sound of wealth the way other people recognize birdsong. Dr. Sterling is the kind of man who has always had money, the kind who confuses privilege with competence, who wears arrogance like a perfume that smells like old Harvard clubs and investment portfolios. He's the unit director here, has been for 7 years, and in those 7 years he has built a reputation on protocols and board connections and the kind of rigid adherence to policy that makes him untouchable. He doesn't see Ashley, not really. She's not the type of person doctors like Sterling ever truly see. She's the kind of person who fades into the background at faculty meetings, who doesn't speak unless called upon, who asks permission before using hospital supplies, who exists in the careful diminished space of people who have learned that being noticed is dangerous. But he pauses anyway, stops at her station as she's updating another chart, and watches her hands for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands are trembling slightly, trembling the way they sometimes do in the early morning, before the day's work settles her nerves, before the focus returns. Sterling's eyes narrow. He makes a note on his tablet. The sound of the stylus against the screen is soft, clinical, final. "Steady hands save lives, Ms. Cooper," he says. His voice is loud enough for the board members to hear. Loud enough that it's not actually directed at her at all. It's directed at them, at the hospital record, at the narrative he's building about a nurse whose hands shake, whose reliability might be in question. Ashley sets down her pen. She takes a measured breath, the kind of breath they train into you in the military, the kind that comes from learning to lower your heart rate when bullets are passing overhead. She meets his eyes. They are pale blue and thoroughly unmoved by the idea that he might be looking at something he doesn't understand. "So does giving a damn, doctor," she says. Her voice is quiet. Her voice is always quiet. But there's something underneath it, something like the steel underneath glacier ice. The board members exchange glances. Sterling's smile doesn't reach his eyes, smiles from people like him rarely do. He walks away. The trauma alert overhead sounds exactly 43 seconds later. Incoming trauma. Severe burns. Priority 1. Trauma Bay 3. Surgical team to ICU. Incoming trauma. Ashley is moving before they finish the announcement, muscle memory and training pulling her toward the doors at a pace that's just slightly faster than the other nurses, just slightly more purposeful. She doesn't run. Nurses don't run. But she moves with the kind of precision that comes from 5 years in combat medicine, from field surgical kits assembled in darkness, from learning that speed and silence are sometimes the same thing. The paramedics wheel the John Doe through the trauma bay doors at 8:56 a.m. The patient is unconscious. The burns cover 45% of his body, 3rd degree, charred skin sloughing away to expose the raw tissue underneath, the kind of burns that smell like charred meat and copper and something else, something like the smell of disaster. They've cut away his clothing. They've covered him with sterile blankets. They've already run 2 large bore 4s and started aggressive fluid resuscitation because burn victims bleed internally, bleed into the spaces between cells, and if you don't replace that fluid fast enough the heart simply stops. The attending surgeon is shouting orders. The respiratory therapist is preparing intubation equipment. The nurses are cutting away more of the burned clothing, assessing, documenting, moving with the controlled urgency of people who know that the next 2 hours determine whether this man lives or dies or exists somewhere in between. And Ashley moves through it all like she was built for exactly this. Her hands have stopped shaking. Her breathing has settled into something deep and even. She's passing supplies, reading monitors, anticipating what the surgical team will need before they ask for it, moving like someone who knows how bodies fail and how hands can sometimes hold them together long enough for medicine to catch up. She's checking the patient's belongings, burned jacket, destroyed clothing, possessions reduced to carbon and ash, when her fingers touch something hard beneath the charred fabric. Metal. Intact. She extracts it carefully, a set of dog tags, still linked by their chain, miraculously untouched by the fire. The heat discolored them slightly. The name is still readable. And her hands go completely still. She doesn't consciously realize she's stopped breathing. The unit insignia on the tags is small, barely visible in the harsh trauma bay lighting, but she knows that insignia the way some people know their own heartbeat. She has worn it. She has bled under it. She has held men's lives in her hands under that insignia in a place called Marja, in Helmand province, in 140-degree heat in a forward operating base where the electricity cut out twice a day and morphine was measured in single vials and mercy was something you carried yourself because no one was coming to carry it for you. That insignia means her son served under this man. The dog tags feel impossibly heavy in her palm. She doesn't let her expression change. She doesn't let anyone see. She simply places them gently in the secure specimen bag, the way protocol requires, the way a nurse who doesn't exist in the background of anyone's memory would place them. But her hands have started trembling again, and this time it's not from the early morning or from the way trauma centers smell or from anything Sterling could possibly understand by looking at her for 3 seconds at a medication chart. The John Doe is wheeled toward the ICU, toward the intensive care unit where the next 72 hours will determine whether he makes it or whether the burns are simply too severe, whether the shock is too profound, whether his body can be convinced to keep fighting. And Ashley follows him, the dog tag she's held briefly imprinted on her palm like a countdown timer that nobody else can see. The John Doe is wheeled toward the ICU, and Ashley follows the stretcher like a shadow, her eyes on the monitor screens, heart rate 128, oxygen saturation 87, core temperature 32.4. The dog tags rest in her scrub pocket. A wait. A countdown. She doesn't know yet that the unconscious man on this gurney is Captain James Morrison, 75th Ranger Regiment, her son's commanding officer. The man who wrote the letter that kept her boy alive through 12 months of Marja. She just knows the unit insignia. She just knows what it means. The burn unit room fills with the sound of ventilator attachment, the click of arterial lines, the rhythmic beeping of a room learning the patient's vital signature. Ashley moves through her assigned roles, documenting effects, securing the burned clothing in evidence bags, cataloging what's left when a building swallows you whole. The dog tags are tangled in what used to be a jacket sleeve. Blackened metal against scorched fabric. She holds them for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to feel her own hand stop trembling for the first time in 3 years. 2 families arrive in the hallway outside. A woman in a grey coat. A man with a cane. They've come to identify other victims from the shelter fire, the fire that started at 11:51 p.m., that claimed for lives, that brought critical burn admissions into Sacred Heart's ICU in a wave of charred flesh and inhalation injury. Ashley hears their voices through the door. The sound of grief tastes like copper. Dr. Sterling enters at 2:14 p.m. He's wearing the kind of pressed white coat that costs money, the kind that doesn't wrinkle because it's touched by fewer hands than usual. His stethoscope hangs like jewelry. He doesn't look at the patient first, he looks at Ashley, and what crosses his face is the expression of a man who has found a problem he can solve by simply removing it from the room. "Cooper, what are you doing?" Her voice is still deferential then. Still apologetic. Still wrapped in the careful invisibility she's cultivated for 3 years. "Sir, I was just securing his personal effects. Chain of custody documentation requires. You were contaminating evidence." He cuts across the room like a blade finding its mark. His voice carries the particular cruelty of a man who has learned that authority sounds better when delivered in front of witnesses. The families outside have gone quiet. They can hear him through the glass. "Do you have any idea what chain of custody means? Or did they not teach that in whatever community college program you stumbled through?" The woman in the grey coat watches. The man with the cane watches. Both of them are waiting for someone to tell them their loved one is dead, and instead they're watching a nurse get dismantled. These people are dealing with real tragedy, and you're playing detective with someone's jewelry. Sterling gestures toward the door, toward the families, toward the only audience that matters to him. His presence fills the room like carbon monoxide, invisible, poisonous, changing the pressure of the air itself. The chain of custody is compromised. The patient's identity cannot be verified through personal effects that a floor nurse has been fondling. One tear escapes Ashley's eye. Just one. She doesn't blink. She doesn't look away. She wipes it with the heel of her hand, a single gesture so controlled it almost breaks Sterling, because what he's looking for is the break, the crack, the moment when a woman folds. Instead, her eyes lock onto his, and something in the set of her jaw becomes suddenly, dangerously still. That ranger has a name, and he deserves better than your paperwork. The sentence hangs in the room like a challenge that hasn't been accepted yet. Sterling's jaw tightens. A small muscle near his temple flickers once. He leans toward her, his voice dropping to a register that is somehow worse than the shouting, quiet, measured, the voice of a man whose power doesn't require volume. My office. Now. But Ashley is already moving. Not retreating. Moving. Her hands are steady on the four-pump as she adjusts the rate, as she checks the airway positioning, as she does the work that matters. Sterling leaves, his authority trailing behind him like a cape that somehow didn't work. The families outside the glass are silent. Ashley doesn't look at them. She doesn't need to. She can feel their eyes, confused, sympathetic, the way strangers look at people who have just been publicly broken and somehow walked away upright. The next 2 hours are procedural. Documentation, charting, vitals every 15 minutes, temperature management on the bear hugger warming blanket, the endless vigilance of critical care. Her hands don't shake. Her voice doesn't crack. She moves through her rounds like a woman operating on muscle memory and something darker than muscle memory, something that knows how to function when the world is trying to make you invisible. At 4:33 p.m., she enters the break room. The fluorescent lights buzz their insectile hum. The vending machine whirs in the corner. For nurses are gathered at the small table, Linda from the day shift, Bryce from post-surgical recovery, Sandra from the ECMO rotation, and Marcus from cardiac. They have their lunches open. Tupperware containers. Baggies with sandwiches. The smell of microwaved leftovers and the particular staleness of a room that hasn't seen real air in 8 hours. Ashley sets her lunch down, a salad she made yesterday, now soft and brown around the edges. Nobody looks at her. That's the thing about silence. It's louder than words. It's a choice. It's a vote cast without a voice. She opens her container. The smell of old vinaigrette rises up. She sits. The 4 nurses gather their food without a word. Not hostile. Not obvious. Just a quiet repositioning. They stand, Linda, Bryce, Sandra, Marcus, and they carry their lunches toward the door, toward the hallway. Sandra says something low to Bryce. They laugh. It's a sound designed to carry. Through the break room window, Ashley watches them settle in the hallway outside. Their voices rise a little, a calculated restoration of normalcy that is meant to be heard. They're discussing a phone, looking at something on a screen, laughing at something she isn't part of. Not anymore. Quarantine, implemented silently, executed perfectly. Not bullying. Just the removal of her from the human equation of the hospital. Just the understanding, shared without being spoken, that standing near her now is a liability. She finishes her salad alone. That evening, Sterling posts the write-up on the unit board. The board is positioned at the entrance to the ICU, the place where every shift change, every handoff, every beginning of a day passes. Yellow highlighter marks 3 violations in the text. The letters are block printed, aggressive, impossible to miss. Unauthorized handling of patient effects. Insubordination. Failure to follow chain of command. Beneath her name, Sterling has written in red ink, underlined, the shaky nurse. 3 nurses read it before Ashley arrives for her shift the next morning. By the time she enters the unit at 6:58 a.m., it's been seen. It's been absorbed. It's become the known truth about her, replacing whatever she was before this moment, competent, careful, invisible. Now she is the shaky nurse. Now she has a name, and it's not Ashley. She reads the violations once. Her reflection appears fragmented in the glass frame of the board, broken into pieces by words that are meant to break her further. She doesn't cry. She doesn't rage. She turns to leave. Sterling is waiting beside the charting station. He's had his coffee. He's had his morning. He's had the satisfaction of watching his words propagate through the unit like a virus. His voice is conversational now, almost kind, which is somehow worse. Perhaps if you focused on competence instead of heroics, Cooper, you'd still have a career worth saving. Her response is so quiet it barely registers. I understand, Doctor. Good. He smiles. Then we won't have any more problems. But that wasn't the problem at all. That afternoon, Sterling makes calls. The first call is to Harold Hartwell, board chairman, golf partner, voice on the other end of the line that says, "Yes, I remember you mentioning something. Liability concerns, you said. A nurse with documented tremors. I'll have legal review her file." The second call goes to the hospital attorney, seeds planted about chain of custody violations that could compromise the shelter fire investigation. The third call, the one Ashley doesn't know about yet, goes to her nursing school in Boulder, requesting performance records under the guise of credential verification. By the time Linda whispers the warning during a bathroom break, the machinery is already in motion. He's building a file, Ashley. A real one, Linda says, her voice dropped to the register of women who share danger like contraband. He called HR. Apparently, he's requesting your complete performance history since you started here. He's talking about liability concerns and whether you should still have direct patient care privileges. Ashley nods. She thanks Linda. She washes her hands at the sink, watching the water turn from brown to clear, and she understands that Dr. Sterling has moved from humiliation to strategy. He stopped trying to break her publicly. Now he's building an architecture of official failure. Now he's making her disappearance look like procedure. That same afternoon, the John Doe is reassigned. Sterling enters the unit at 2:34 p.m. and approaches Ashley at the medication cart. Cooper, you're on post-surgical recovery. Effective immediately. Bryce will take over your current case. It's not a question. There's no negotiation. Just a statement of fact delivered in front of 3 other nurses. Just the removal of her access to the patient whose dog tags are still in her pocket. Just the transfer of care to a competent technician who knows how to follow every protocol exactly, which is exactly the problem. Bryce is 2 years out of nursing school. He's meticulous. He's careful. He has never served in the military. He doesn't recognize the name Marja. He doesn't understand that you can follow every procedure in a textbook and still miss the moment when a patient stops fighting. Ashley watches as Bryce takes vitals by checklist. She watches his eyes move across the monitor screens. She watches him miss what she already sees, the patient's oxygen saturation dropping point by point. 89, 87. 85, the slow decline of a man whose lungs are still burning from the inside. She mentions it. His O2 is trending down. He was at 92 last check. We might want to adjust the FiO2 on the vent. Bryce looks at the monitor. He shrugs. His voice is the voice of a man reading a script. Still within parameters. Sterling appears beside her instantly. Teleportation. Omniscience. The supernatural ability of certain men to arrive the moment they're needed most. Is there a problem, Cooper? Or are you questioning another nurse's competence now? The monitor shows O2 at 89%. It's falling. Ashley knows it's falling. She can feel the trajectory the way some people feel pressure changes before a storm. But Sterling is blocking her view. Sterling is positioning his body between her and the patient. Sterling is making eye contact that says, not one more word. Recovery wing. Now. Or add insubordination to your growing list. Ashley's hands start to shake as she walks away. They shake as she passes the evidence cart. They shake as she sees the dog tags, now sealed in a clear plastic bag labeled patient property, do not remove. The tremors return, not from fear, but from the particular helplessness of watching someone die by protocol while you're forced to look away. That evening, at home, her son asks about her day. She's standing in the kitchen, still in her scrubs, still carrying the smell of the ICU in her hair. The combat boots sit by the door, old, worn, the leather cracked from 3 years of being stored in a closet she doesn't open anymore. The boots from Kandahar. The boots from another life. Fine, she lies. Just a long shift. Her phone buzzes at 8:24 p.m. A voicemail from the hospital attorney requesting an interview. Formal. Official. The machinery grinding forward. Sterling has brought in outside investigators. The machinery grinding forward. Sterling has brought in outside investigators. What they didn't know was that machines can be redirected. At 7:08 on Thursday morning, Dr. Sterling sat in his corner office on the 4th floor, mahogany desk between him and the world like a fortress wall, and made the first call. His voice was smooth as oil on water. "Richard, it's Marcus Sterling." "Yes, from Sacred Heart. I need your discretion on a liability matter." Pause. He listened to Richard Hartwell, the board chairman, breathe on the other end, a man whose net worth was measured in 8 figures and whose patience for institutional risk was measured in seconds. "We have a nurse who violated chain of command during a critical trauma. Handled patient effects without authorization. I documented it, but the pattern suggests deeper issues. Judgment problems. I wanted to give you a heads up before it becomes an incident." Another pause. Sterling's jaw tightened with satisfaction. The seed was planted. Hartwell would make calls. Hartwell always made calls. By 1100, the effect rippled downward like a stone through still water. Ashley arrived for her 1200 shift to find the schedule board rewritten. Her name had moved from ICU rotation to the medical surgical ward on the 3rd floor. The same ward where patient acuity was low, where monitoring was perfunctory, where a senior chief petty officer's instincts would rust from disuse. The notice was stamped with Supervisor Chen's signature, but Ashley recognized the handwriting style in the margin notes as belonging to Sterling's administrative assistant. Not a request. A reassignment. Strategic, calculated, designed to look like routine staffing rather than what it actually was, institutional isolation. She stood in front of the board for exactly 4 seconds. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply memorized the changes and moved toward the med-surg ward, her scrubs making that soft whispering sound against her thighs with each step. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant drone, indifferent to the machinery grinding forward around her. The real pressure came at 14:30. Ashley was checking full lines on a post-operative knee replacement when her badge suddenly refused to scan the door to the records room. She swiped it 3 times. Nothing. The lock clicked red. Access denied. She walked to the nursing station where Chen stood updating charts, her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she'd been briefed. "Your access has been restricted to med-surg patients only," Chen said without looking up. "Dr. Sterling submitted the request this morning. Patient confidentiality protocols." It wasn't a lie. It was a perfect institutional lie, the kind that looked legitimate under fluorescent light, the kind that would survive any audit. Ashley needed access to Morrison's chart to monitor his treatment plan. That access had just been surgically removed. She nodded once and turned away. Still not trembling. Still not breaking. But the net was tightening, and they both knew it. By 1900, the scheduling changes compounded like interest on debt. Ashley pulled up the rotation chart and found that her ICU shifts had been replaced with med-surg floor duty extending through the next 4 weeks. The notice cited skill level matching and departmental resource optimization, language so bureaucratically smooth it could have been authored by corporate lawyers, which it almost certainly had been. Sterling was weaponizing the institution itself, using protocols and procedures like a man wielding a knife with surgical precision. Each cut was clean, deniable, institutional. each one slowly bleeding her away from the patient she needed to monitor, from the ranger whose condition was deteriorating under inadequate care. The machinery grinding forward. Sterling sits 2 floors above, making phone calls to men who make phone calls to men. The board chairman knows something is wrong. The nursing supervisors know something is wrong. But wrong in institutional terms isn't criminal. It's bureaucratic. It's procedural. It's exactly what happens when one man with reputation and connections decides another person doesn't belong. Ashley worked med-surg until 1900. She saw 12 patients, changed 18 dressings, managed for post-operative complications with the kind of invisible competence that goes unnoticed because it works. Nobody understood that the young man in room 312 recovering from appendectomy didn't get an infection because of her meticulous hand hygiene. Nobody understood that the woman in room 308 woke up clear-headed instead of confused because Ashley was present during her emergence from anesthesia. Competence in the shadows goes unremembered. It's only visible when it's absent. At 1945, standing in the med-surg break room near the vending machine, Ashley overheard 2 nurses talking. One was Maria, who'd worked with Ashley for 2 years without ever asking difficult questions. The other was Jennifer, new to the unit, still learning which supervisors could be trusted. Yeah, she grabbed that patient's belongings without waiting for protocol, Maria was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're repeating gossip but want to sound neutral. Sterling had to document it. I mean, she should know better. She's been here 3 years. Jennifer nodded, absorbing it, filing it into her mental catalogue of Sacred Heart politics. Ashley listened from around the corner, her hand on the vending machine, feeding a dollar bill into the slot with mechanical precision. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Nobody looked at her. Nobody had to. The whisper campaign was working exactly as Sterling had designed it to work. What they didn't know was that whisper campaigns only work if the target is trying to defend themselves. Ashley wasn't defending. She was observing. She was watching the machinery grind, watching the network activate, watching a man use every institutional tool at his disposal to slowly separate her from the patient who might die without her. By 2100, the patterns were clear as ultrasound images. Sterling had moved through his escalation with the precision of someone who'd weaponized institutions before. First the public humiliation, the social attack designed to establish narrative dominance. Then the documentation, the formal write-up that made everything look procedurally justified. Now the strategic moves, access restrictions, schedule changes, supervisor pressure, reputation damage. Each action individually defensible. Collectively, they constituted a slow institutional expulsion. Ashley drove home through Denver rain that hammered the windshield like applause, her old truck's wipers squeaking against the glass at intervals. The roads gleamed under streetlights. She thought about Morrison lying in ICU without her monitoring, without her instincts, without someone who understood what tension pneumothorax looked like in its early stages. She thought about the dog tags in the evidence bag, about the unit insignia that matched her son's deployment photos. She thought about Captain Morrison's letter, the one that had kept her son alive through 12 months of hell in Marja. The machinery grinding forward. Sterling sits at home tonight feeling satisfied. The board chairman is satisfied. The supervisors are satisfied. They've handled their problem without ever directly attacking her. They've used the institution itself as a weapon, and the institution is far more effective than any direct confrontation could ever be. But Ashley isn't trembling. She's waiting. She's observing. She's calculating the angles like someone who's learned that sometimes the greatest power is in perfect stillness. The dog tags are still in the evidence bag. Captain Morrison is still in bed for the ICU. And somewhere in the machinery grinding forward, there's a critical moment approaching, the moment where observation becomes action, where strategic patience becomes something far more dangerous. She pulled into her apartment complex at 21:55. The rain continued its assault on the parking lot. Inside, her apartment was dark except for the kitchen light she'd left on this morning. She walked past her bedroom, past the framed photo of her son in his army dress uniform, past the battered storage unit rental invoice taped to her refrigerator, the one for the unit in South Denver where her decoration still sat locked away like the person she used to be. She poured water into a glass and stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain, waiting for the phone call she knew was coming. At 22:47, her phone buzzed. Text from Chen, forwarded from hospital administration, emergency call-in. Multiple ICU nurses out with flu. Need you in rotation. 0100 start. Mandatory. Ashley read it once. Read it again. The machinery grinding forward had just shifted into a new gear. And for the first time in 3 years, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper felt something that wasn't fear, wasn't dread, wasn't the careful civilian composure she'd been maintaining. It felt like preparation. Her phone rang at 0100. Not a text. Not an email. A call, which meant emergency, which meant ICU was burning through staff. Ashley was awake before the second ring, muscle memory from 12 years of military deployment running deeper than civilian sleep cycles. The flu had swept through Sacred Heart's nursing staff like shrapnel through a convoy. 3 nurses out. 2 calling in sick for the next shift. The charge nurse's voice was tight. We need bodies. Can you come in? Ashley dressed in the dark. Scrubs. Jacket. The worn boots, the one she'd kept at the bottom of her locker like an anchor. She didn't think about why she was pulling them on instead of the white sneakers most floor nurses wore. Some decisions bypassed the conscious mind entirely. By 01:45, she was pushing through the ICU doors. The unit looked like a tactical failure. 3 critical patients. 2 nurses visible. 1 respiratory therapist moving between beds with the jerky, exhausted movements of someone running on fumes and coffee. The charge nurse, Marcus, spotted her and exhaled like she'd just thrown him a lifeline. Thank God. Morrison in Bay 7 is deteriorating. Patel's with him now. We've got a post-op sepsis in Bay 2, and Bay 4 is headed toward multi-organ failure. No attending on the floor. Sterling signed out to Dr. Reeves 20 minutes ago. Reeves is at another facility. Ashley didn't respond. Didn't need to. She was already assessing vitals at the monitor station, heart rates climbing, blood pressures dropping, O2 saturations drifting down like a slow descent. The monitors were speaking a language she'd learned in field hospitals where the only medicine was speed and precision. She moved to Bay 7 without being asked. Morrison lay unconscious, his chest rising with diminishing depth. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that weren't cooperating. Resident Dr. Patel stood at the bedside, checking a chest X-ray on the monitor, his expression cycling between confusion and concern. His O2 sat just dropped to 78, Patel said, not looking up from the image. BP's climbing. Heart rate's at 140. I don't understand. The sedation is stable, the vent settings are, he didn't finish because he didn't need to. Ashley was already reading the signs. The way Morrison's chest wall moved, unequal, the right side barely expanding. The way his neck veins were distended like cables. The way the monitors told a story of a lung collapsing under pressure. Tension pneumothorax. A lung rupture trapping air in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, pushing the heart sideways, strangling him from the inside out. Fatal in minutes if untreated. Treatable in seconds if you knew what you were looking at. He's got a tension pneumo, Ashley said. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Now. Her voice didn't ask. It commanded. 3 years of bedside nursing had taught her how to say please, how to defer to physicians, how to make herself smaller. All of that evaporated. What remained was Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper, the one who'd trained combat medics, who'd worked under fire, whose hands had learned how to save lives when hospitals were a blur of dust and blood and urgency. The one she'd buried in a storage unit across Denver. Patel's head snapped up. We need to get him to imaging first, confirm the diagnosis, he'll be dead before you get him downstairs, Ashley interrupted. O2 sats dropping. We do this now or we call his next of kin. She was already moving, gloved, pushing the surgical tray toward the bed. Her hands weren't shaking. That surprised her, the absence of tremor, the complete steadiness. 3 years of careful civilian caution, of taking antacids before shifts, of sleeping with one eye open because of what her hands had done in conflict zones. All of it dissolved. What emerged was certainty. She prepped the site with antiseptic, her movements precise, economical. No wasted motion. Her fingers found the landmark, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the exact point where a needle inserted at the right angle would puncture the pleural membrane and release the pressure building like a hydraulic press against Morrison's heart. Behind her, Patel was still gloving up, his hands fumbling through the process. Ashley didn't wait. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand, angled, positioned. She found the landmark by touch and feel, something learned in tents and vehicles where you operated by experience because equipment failed and darkness was the default. The needle went in. The hiss of released pressure filled the room like a sigh. Air escaping. The pressure releasing. The lung re-expanding. For a moment, the only sound was that hiss and the ventilator's mechanical rhythm resuming a healthier pattern. Morrison's O2 sat ticked up, 81%, 88%, 94%. The monitors stabilized. The cables of his neck veins loosened. His chest wall expanded symmetrically again, both sides rising in unison. Patel stared at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" Ashley didn't answer. She was already checking the sharps container, already confirming the placement, already monitoring vitals with the focused attention of someone who understood that this man's next 60 seconds were critical. She'd saved lives in Kandahar province under Taliban fire. She could manage this. For 20 minutes, she was senior chief again. She monitored Morrison's vitals. She confirmed the decompression was holding. She stayed at his bedside while Patel contacted imaging to confirm the tension pneumo resolution and while Marcus called the on-call physician. She was precise, efficient, steady. All the things she'd trained to be back when her rank meant something other than a distant memory locked in a storage unit. At 0320, Sterling arrived. He didn't walk into the unit. He entered it, and the air pressure changed. The hospital attorney followed him, a woman named Hartwell, sharp-eyed and already taking notes. Behind them came 2 board members in golf jackets thrown over pajamas, Davies and Mitchell, summoned from their homes by a physician powerful enough that they answered calls at 3 in the morning. Dr. Sterling's network was activated. His reach extended past the ICU, past the hospital walls, into the rooms of men who owed him favors. He moved like a military operation, coordinated, prepared, executed with the precision of someone who understood institutional power the way warriors understood battlefields. He surveyed the scene, Ashley at Morrison's bedside. Patel explaining the emergency procedure. The decompression needle in the sharps container. The stabilized vitals. Sterling's face remained neutral. Controlled. Which meant he'd been waiting for this moment. Ms. Cooper performed an unauthorized invasive procedure, Sterling told Hartwell, not Ashley. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of calm that comes from having already prepared his defense. Without physician supervision. On a patient she was explicitly reassigned from. Against direct institutional directive. The attorney made notes. Her pen moved with the precision of someone documenting the end of a career. Hartwell looked at the monitors, then at Morrison's improved condition, then back to Sterling. She didn't seem impressed. Given her documented tremors, Sterling continued, the multiple policy violations already on record, and now this reckless intervention. He paused, letting the implication settle. Tremors. Incompetence. A nurse so unstable she couldn't be trusted, now proven right by her own recklessness. He was dying, Ashley said. One measured breath. Her voice was level. Controlled. The voice of someone who'd watched people die and learned not to flinch. I performed needle decompression for tension pneumothorax. Second intercostal, midclavicular. His O2 sat recovered to 94%. His heart rate stabilized. His blood pressure returned to baseline. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't defend herself. Just stated facts the way a combat veteran states coordinates. I saved his life. Sterling's expression tightened by a fraction of a millimeter, the only crack in his composed exterior. You ended your career, he said quietly. By 0600, security was escorting Ashley to her locker. The same guard who'd screened her employee photo 3 years ago carried the cardboard box, won't meet her eyes. Her badge was deactivated. The digital locks on the unit doors wouldn't recognize her anymore. She was a ghost in a building where she'd worked for 3 years, where she'd learned to hide, where she'd pretended to be something smaller than what she was. Sterling watched from his office window as she carried the box through the lobby. Past the night shift arriving. Past the coffee station where nurses clustered before their shifts. Past the life she'd constructed from pieces in a hospital that didn't know what it was discarding. The combat boots were at the bottom of the box, the soles worn smooth from 1,000 miles in desert and mountain terrain. Outside, rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance no one was supposed to understand. Ashley pushed through the ER doors, the cardboard box heavy against her chest, and stepped into the Denver night where no one knew that she'd just saved a man's life and lost everything doing it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding that stepping over the edge might be the only way back up. Ashley sat at her kitchen table in scrubs that still smelled like hospital antiseptic and her own sweat, staring at nothing. The clock on the wall read 2:56 p.m. She'd been sent home at 7:27 a.m. with a cardboard box containing 8 years of accumulated shift memories, a coffee mug from a 12-hour trauma marathon, a thank you card from a patient's daughter, a photo of the ICU staff from 3 years ago when she was still invisible enough to be happy. The box sat unopened on the counter behind her. She couldn't look at it. Her son found her like that, shoulders hunched, both hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee she'd stopped drinking an hour ago. He was home on emergency leave, 2 weeks compressed into 7 days, which meant something had happened at Fort Carson that his unit commander had deemed significant enough to pull him from duty. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his Army combat uniform and asked the only question that mattered, "Mom, what happened?" Ashley didn't answer. She turned her head toward the front door where her old combat boots sat on the worn oak floor, the pair she'd kept as a talisman for 18 years, the ones with laces tied in the exact knot they'd taught her at Kandahar, the heel scuffed down from 1,000 patrol corridors in Marja where she'd learned that pain was information and information kept people alive. The leather had darkened from tan to almost black, creased along the arch where her younger feet had been shaped by 120-degree desert heat and the weight of keeping rangers alive when the only tools were her hands and her training and her absolute refusal to let anyone die under her care. The last piece of careful reconstruction crumbled then. Not dramatically. Not with tears or trembling or the kind of breakdown that announces itself. Just a slow settling, like watching concrete cure in reverse, watching a structure that had taken 3 years to build simply accept that it was no longer holding. The boots by the door represented everything she'd buried, the rank she'd never mentioned, the tours she'd rewritten into non-existence, the screaming in her sleep that she'd learned to muffle with a pillow and 3 melatonin tablets. The woman in scrubs who'd convinced herself that pushing a med-surg cart and charting vitals and staying invisible was enough to constitute a life. It wasn't. Her son moved into the kitchen and sat down across from her without asking permission, the way military children do. He was 23 years old and he still deferred to her, still waited for instructions, still treated her apartment like a base camp where the rules were hers to establish. Now he just waited. "I made a choice," Ashley said finally. Her voice sounded like someone else's, lower, flatter, the accent of command she'd spent 3 years training out of her civilian vocabulary. "Years ago. I left. Everything. I thought I could just stop." "Stop what?" "Being what I was." He didn't push. Military children understand the architecture of silence. Instead, he stood and said, "Get changed. We're going back to the hospital." "I was fired." "There's nothing to." "You're going to collect your final paycheck," he interrupted, and there was something in his voice, the echo of his own commanding officer, the residue of training that had shaped him into someone who gave orders and expected them followed. Then we're going to the ICU. The drive took 14 minutes. Her son drove her beat-up Honda Civic with one hand, the other arm resting out the window, and neither of them spoke. Denver sprawled around them, the late afternoon sun hitting the buildings at an angle that made everything look cheaper, more temporary, like a stage set someone had forgotten to tear down. The hospital appeared like a monument to every decision she'd made wrong, and Ashley's hands went rigid on her thighs. They didn't go to payroll first. Her son steered them toward the ICU, past the nurse's station where Linda looked up and quickly looked away, past the break room where the silence had been louder than accusations, toward the room where Captain Morrison had been listed as critical condition, unidentified, until she'd found his dog tags tangled in his burned jacket like a prayer someone else had already answered. The door was partially open. Morrison was sitting up slightly, propped on 3 pillows, his burns wrapped in clean gauze and his eyes tracking something on the ceiling like he was trying to read meaning in acoustic tiles. His gaze shifted when they entered. It took for seconds, the time it takes for recognition to travel through a brain that's been starved of oxygen, through morphine and concussions and the simple exhaustion of being burned. Then his eyes focused on Ashley's face and he whispered a single word that cracked something open in the room. Reaper. Her son's face went white. Actually white, the color of someone who'd just realized the ground beneath him had shifted. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Wait. Your rank is, he stopped. Swallowed. Mom. You're a senior chief petty officer. Ashley moved to Morrison's bedside without answering her son. She pulled his file, the paper kind, because Morrison had been brought in as a Jane Doe and the digital records hadn't caught up with the reality of him yet. The chart was thin, mostly intake notes and burn assessments and the standard vitals of a man pulled from a fire at a veterans shelter on West 41st Street. But clipped to the inside was a transfer notation, a forwarded document from the Army's medical liaison, and Ashley's hands didn't shake when she opened it. 3 tours. 2 Bronze Stars. And a citation, formal, stamped, dated July 2009, that named her Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, in recognition of direct action medical intervention resulting in the survival of Captain Thomas Morrison and 23 service members during the Marja Offensive, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The words on the page were the same words she'd carried for 14 years without letting anyone read them. The same tour that had broken her hands into trembling things. The same mission where she'd learned that some people were worth more than your own stability, worth more than your own mental health, worth the permanent fracture in your sleep schedule and your faith in a body that was supposed to keep working when everything else had stopped. The knock on the door was quiet. When Ashley looked up, the hospital administrator stood in the doorway, Hartwell, a woman with grey hair pulled back tight enough to stretch her skin and the kind of expression that meant she'd already read every file, every email, every piece of evidence that had been gathered in the 4 days since Sterling had walked into that office with his cardboard box and his absolute conviction that removing Ashley Cooper would restore order to his kingdom. Behind her was another man in dress blues, navy uniform, pin-thin and built like someone who'd spent 20 years running through desert heat with a rifle, with the bearing of someone who gave orders to people who actually listened. The Navy SEAL liaison introduced himself by his last name only, Commander Williams, and he held a leather portfolio that Ashley recognized immediately as a service record. Not her civilian personnel file. Her actual file. Classified. Restricted. The one that lived in a bunker somewhere with her real name and real credentials and the 23 redacted names of everyone she'd saved who probably shouldn't have made it home alive. Hartwell stood in the doorway. Williams opened the portfolio in the ICU hallway where the nurse's station had gone completely silent, where Linda was no longer looking away and where every single person who'd fled the break room when Ashley had sat alone with her coffee was now very deliberately paying attention. Williams read her decorations aloud, each one its own sentence, each one a beat of recognition. Bronze Star. Ashley's son made a sound like air escaping. Purple Heart. Morrison closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Meritorious Service Medal. Hartwell's expression didn't change. She was watching Sterling's office from where she stood, watching the glass door that had closed on him when she'd told him to wait there while the investigation concluded. And the Navy Cross. The silence was so complete you could hear the ventilator in Morrison's room wheeze its mechanical rhythm, could hear the fluorescent lights hum their constant frequency, could hear the subtle shift of every person in the ICU understanding that they'd been looking at a legend and calling her just a nurse. Sterling opened his mouth once. His hands moved toward the office door, either to leave or to finally explain something. Ashley would never know which. Hartwell raised one hand, palm outward, and didn't say a word. The silence that followed was the kind that ends careers. It was the kind of silence that turns 15 years of reputation into a business card that nobody would call. 1 week later, the security guard who'd handed Ashley her cardboard box on the morning of her termination walked into Sterling's office with an identical box, slightly more battered, folded where it had already held something precious. The guard's voice was professional, stripped of personal preference. "Dr. Sterling, I'll need your badge and access cards." "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Sterling didn't argue. He didn't call anyone. He just picked up his box and walked through the same lobby he'd commanded, past the same nurses who'd watched him orchestrate a senior chief's destruction, and when nobody looked at him as he passed, he finally understood what he'd done. Ashley stood in her dress blues at Morrison's bedside. Williams had insisted, just once, for the ranger to see her as she actually was, and her son stood beside her in his army uniform, 18 years of raising a single mother suddenly making sense in a way it never had before. Morrison was stronger now, nearly recovered, ready for discharge, ready to tell his own commander that yes, he'd found her, the one who'd saved him in Marja and again at 0300 in an ICU that had tried to keep her away from him. "Reaper," Morrison said again. Not a question. A statement of fact. A recognition of rank and service and the particular type of heroism that involves hands steady enough to save someone's life even when those same hands had spent 3 years learning to shake. Ashley helped him to his feet, steady hands guiding him toward the lobby where his family was waiting with flowers and tears and the kind of gratitude that doesn't fit into words. Her son carried the combat boots, the ones from by the door, the ones she'd finally brought to the hospital because some things can't stay hidden forever. The ICU staff watched through the window as Ashley walked Morrison to his discharge. Through the glass, they could see everything, the woman in dress blues with the bearing of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions in languages they couldn't speak, the way Morrison deferred to her even in recovery, the absolute authority in her posture that had been there all along, buried under 3 years of civilian camouflage. By the following week, the hospital grapevine had already delivered Sterling's new address, a folding table at a strip mall off Colfax, selling supplemental health insurance to people who didn't know they were buying from a man whose medical license was under board review, whose network had evaporated completely, whose 15 years of institutional authority had collapsed in 72 hours once people actually understood what Ashley Cooper was. She returned to bedside nursing the following Monday, refused the supervisor promotion, asked only to return to her old ICU shifts. Just Ashley. Just bedside. Just the quiet work of saving lives in the dark with the combat boots sitting by her front door, finally no longer a secret. Her son understood now. Morrison understood. The nurses understood. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The truth doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides for 3 years in scrubs and trembling hands and a cardboard box of keepsakes. And sometimes, just sometimes, it surfaces when someone needs saving badly enough that the person who can do it stops caring about staying invisible. So if you've ever been underestimated by someone with authority, if you've ever hidden who you really were to survive in a space that felt hostile, if you've ever watched someone in quiet scrubs or a service uniform and wondered what story they weren't telling, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Drop a comment and tell us, would you have stayed silent, or would you have saved him too? Because heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, sometimes with shaking hands that steady when it matters most. Sometimes saving lives in the dark.